And for more reaction on what's going on in Ukraine, earlier I spoke with UK Member of Parliament George Galloway. I first asked him how he would like to see the EU proceed regarding the conflict in the country.
Well, the European Union would first of all be best to distance itself from the ludicrous, nonsensical approach that the United States government is taking. After all, from the luxury of many thousands of miles away, the United States can take a certain view and strike a certain chord and note. But the European Union is cheek by jowl with Russia, always has been, always will be, is dependent on trade and energy with Russia and should not poke the bear with a stick, not just because there's no justification for doing so, but because it cannot possibly be in our own national interest. The British government, of course, which has invaded and occupied in massive numbers of soldiers and occupation troops, country after country over the last 10, 15 years, been complicit in killing more than 1 million people in those occupations, is in the last possible position to lecture other people about what they do about events in a country on its own doorstep. The facts of the matter are that Russia has every right, indeed obligation, to act in defense of its compatriots, its citizens, its economic and military assets, which it has on the territory of the Ukraine, by agreement and by treaty. No Russian government, at least not one worthy of the name government, could possibly allow such things to be endangered, imperiled, without taking the action that President Putin has taken.
And George, I want to talk about the opposition in Ukraine. Recently, you actually referred to the demonstrators as terrorists. Do you still stand by that claim?
I do. Of course, not everyone involved in the demonstrations in the Maidan were terrorists or even extremists, although most of the heavy lifting in the fighting with the police and security forces was done by ultra-nationalists at best and outright Nazis and fascists at worst, and they had some very peculiar friends, from the far-right Republican Senator John McCain to superannuated, retired, apparently, Israeli military officers who were talking about their work on the Maidan in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz just the other day. So undoubtedly, if you're killing policemen, if you're setting policemen on fire, if you are taking over by physical force the organs of the state, driving the elected president from the land, and forcing members of parliament to put their hands up under duress for changes to the government and so on, then if that was happening anywhere else, you can be sure the BBC would be calling them terrorists, no doubt at all.
Well, we do know that Ukrainians had a number of grievances with the government, including, lack of jobs, high inflation, government corruption, and that was all reflected in the president's public opinion polls leading up to the original protests. In your opinion, what could or should the opposition have done, if not take to the streets and protest?
Well, let me say I agree with what you've said there. I'm not here holding any kind of candle for Yanukovych. In fact, I think he was a pretty awful president, and the corruption and the existence of oligarchy power in Ukraine is something that has been inimical to the standard of life, the quality of life of every person, whether Ukrainian or Russian speaking, in the territory. But it's quite simple what they could have done. The president, under pressure, no doubt, from the demonstrations, but in negotiation, in agreement with European Union ministers, agreed to bring forward an early presidential election, just a few months from now. And of course, Yanukovych could have been voted out, probably would have been voted out at that point. But that's not what happened. It's a bit like the situation in Egypt. President Morsi was a very bad president, but he'd only been in for a year, and the way to get rid of a bad president is to vote them out. Otherwise, anarchy rules and prevails. And normally, of course, the Western media is very clear about that, except where the anarchy is in their interests. In this case, anarchy was hoped to put Russia in a difficult place. And it is a preoccupation of Western policymakers and their media echo chamber to make life as difficult as possible for Russia.
That was George Galloway, a member of the UK Parliament's Respect Party.